Today I'm here with Steve Baker. Steve is the former Minister of Northern Ireland, MP for Wickham and Chair of the notorious ERG. A Tory in the true sense of the word, he is indeed a rebel. But most importantly to Steve, he is a Liberal. And he has been a huge support to me throughout my journey. So, Steve, thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, Jamila, you're very welcome. It's a delight to be with you.
Thank you. Thank you. So, Steve, let's get into it. It seems that everyone considers themselves to be a Liberal these days. The Labour Party believe they are the purveyors of left-wing Liberal ideas. The Liberal Democrats descended from Gladstone's Liberal Party. And then we have the Liberals and Libertarians of the right. So let's settle this once and for all. What is a Liberal?
If only we could settle it once and for all. A Liberal is somebody who believes in freedom. And I think that freedom is always freedom from the government. It's also freedom from coercion by other people, criminal coercion. So it should be freedom. And I think there's 12 principles for a free society. Okay. I'm going to get them right. Civil society instead of the state doing everything. So that's that layer between the individual and the state. Democracy as the means to control power, keep it accountable. Equality before the law, moral equality, political equality, equality of opportunity, but crucially not equality of outcome. Come back to that. Free enterprise, freedom itself, human rights, justice, peace, private property, the rule of law, spontaneous order, which seems to be something we've completely forgotten. And my favourite is toleration. We've forgotten that to tolerate something is to agree to disagree. And we should be capable of agreeing to disagree and going our way in peace on matters where it's not necessary to coerce other people. And this capacity to disagree gracefully is something that seems to have been lost. So somebody who believes in the principles of a free society, individual liberty and spontaneous order. And I'm afraid that is no longer the consensus.
So spontaneous order, what does that mean?
It means that if you let people get on and cooperate, they will put in place institutions that suit themselves and allow them to serve one another's needs. So, for example, you don't really need the state to tell farmers how to produce wheat, for bakers to produce bread, and for retailers to sell it to the public. You know, that it's just, I remember watching the BBC once, because of course, and they were showing some shots of lorries on the road and supermarkets and this and that, and saying it's amazing that anyone runs the country. And it's like, yes, it would be amazing, but you can't run the country in that sense. You've just got to let people get on with it. And the state has a role. It should provide some infrastructure. It should provide a criminal justice and defence and so on. But even with infrastructure, people complain that we're still relying on Victorian infrastructure. And it's crazy. Victorian infrastructure was built by the private sector.
Interesting.
Yeah, of course it was. And we had these enormous booms in infrastructure, in roads and canals and railways in the private sector. And now we're complaining that since the state took over the provision of infrastructure, we haven't got enough of it. And it's honestly, it makes me roll my eyes.
Yeah, that's interesting. So why do you think that businesses can't, build the infrastructure? Do you just think there's too much red tape? Is there too much?
Well, the planning systems, the planning system's a complete nightmare and gets right in the way. But it is, of course, state land use planning. It's the planning of land use by the state. It's socialism. And it drives me mad. People can't see socialism when it's right there in front of them. But so that, but also if you listen to my friend, Professor George Selgin, he talks about the way bonds were issued to finance the railways across America in the 19th century. And it was possible to do that financing when money held its value. But of course, since 1971, the value of money has been in free fall. So that creates a categorically different monetary environment, makes it much more difficult for the private sector to engage in those long-term investments, basically the argument. But yeah, the combination of state land use planning plus a mad financial system right now.
Well, that does actually bring me to my next question quite seamlessly. You actually said recently and just now that too many people are incapable of recognizing socialism when it stares them in the face. So why don't they want to be free?
Well, it's interesting. What does free mean? So the reason that freedom, I think, frightens people is it means responsibility. It means not casting all your cares and costs on someone else. It was Bastiat who wrote that the state was an attempt by everyone to live at the expense of everyone else, if I recall correctly. And that's what's happening, and we can't afford it. I mean, if you look at the OBR's fiscal projections, they're all disastrous. Spending soars away, and even at the current excruciatingly high levels, taxation revenues stagnates. There's an enormous gap emerging, and it's a problem. We can't afford to go on like this. And if we care about other people, we need to adopt a social system that allows us to provide for those who can't provide for themselves.
Yeah.
So I think people are afraid of having to provide for themselves. They'd be much better able to provide for themselves, of course, if taxes were lower. And that feeds back to why doesn't the private sector do things?
Yeah.
Well, we keep taking the private sector's money from them,
Yeah, totally.
and then wondering why they don't do things.
Yeah.
We keep forcing unproductive bureaucracy on companies and then wondering why they're not very productive.
Right.
And I think people are very, well, I know from the evidence and from my work with Professor Paul Dolan, people are hardwired for agreement within groups. And they tend to see the out group as other and disagree furiously with them and see no good in them. But I think with a lot of this, we're very used to the institutions that we have. It's like asking a fish about the water. But state land use planning, you know, it's incredible. Since it was introduced after the Second World War, we've ended up that we just don't provide the houses we need, for example. And people say place with a capital P,
right.
Always annoys me. But the places that we really value are the historic places like Marlow, and Henley, and loads of places, Windsor, places that were built before the state land use regime that came in with the Town and Country Planning Act. And really, we've just got to be much more humble about what state coercion can actually achieve.
Yeah. So in terms of like why people don't want to be free, do you think post-COVID that has got worse? Are people so reliant on the state now that they don't know how to kind of step away from it?
Well, this is one of the themes of Karl Popper's The Open Society and Its Enemies, this balance between freedom and security. And both freedom and security are very profound human desires. But to me, the issue really is our social system working? And can we afford it? Will it go on or will it stop? And to me, our social system in very many important ways isn't working adequately. And we can't afford it, and things can't go on, will stop.
Yeah.
So what are we going to do? And the problem cannot be that government has been too small, spent too little, taxed too little, borrowed too little, or debased the currency too little with too much, had too much sound money. Because we've had the reverse of all those things throughout our lives.
Yeah.
We've had easy money, big government, high taxes, borrowing, heavy intervention in every sector.
Yeah.
And it is the doctrine of interventionism, managing other people's lives, that's failing, not the doctrine of freedom, which I'm afraid was one of the casualties of the First and Second World War.
Right. So, obviously we're under a Labour government now, and Keir Starmer is a self-proclaimed socialist.
Yeah.
And how do we, have any freedom when we are in a Labour government with Keir Starmer, who wants to ban things like smoking in pub gardens, making teachers teach kids how to brush their teeth at school when they should be learning? What do we do?
Well, what do we do? I think we have to make attractive the doctrines of freedom and personal responsibility, and point to where society will go if the state takes responsibility for brushing children's teeth.
Crazy.
I mean, and absolves parents from the responsibility. I mean, I'm not a parent, so I'll be a bit careful about it, but I'm sure many kids don't want their teeth brushed, but it's the parents' responsibility to get them over that, and not the state's. Do we really want to tell teachers that they brush children's teeth now? They're dental hygienists. I mean, how much training a teacher's going to have in dental hygiene? I mean, it's really crazy, but there's an enormous literature of freedom. But I'm afraid one of the big issues is this problem of groupthink.
Yeah.
It's very convenient. We're hardwired psychologically to agree with one another.
Right.
And Hayek wrote about the intellectuals and socialism, and he really was using the term intellectual contemptuously.
Right.
He was talking about the so-called second-hand dealers in ideas. So people like me, politicians, I'm not an originator of ideas. I read other people's, try and synthesize them, but journalists as well. And, you don't often see a journalist, maybe Andrew Neil might do it, but you don't often see a journalist say, why is the government doing that?
Yeah.
Why don't you leave that to civil society to do?
Right.
If you lowered taxes, wouldn't companies be better able to invest as they thought fit to serve the consumer? They don't often see those questions asked by journalists.
Right.
It's always, why doesn't the state do more?
Yeah.
Why is the state, why aren't you surely you're failing because the state would succeed if only you were a better politician.
Right.
It's insane. So we need, really, what our society needs is a willingness to break out of groupthink and challenge consensus, which is tricky for people to do, especially in the environment that social media cultivates, of real hostility when people differ in their opinions. True. I don't doubt you and I will disagree about something, but it doesn't mean we have to fall out with one another and think there's no good in one another.
Yeah.
And this is not idealism. This is part of the principles of a free society, being able to engage rationally and constructively and critically with one another without rejecting one another as individuals.
Right. It goes back to what you said on tolerance and being able to disagree agreeably. I think it's just the basics of being an adult, I would think.
You would think so, wouldn't you? And yet somehow those basics have quit the horizon too often.
Right.
I've got a tweet in draft telling the anonymous trolls they just will be blocked if I see them.
Yeah.
I don't mind disagreeing with someone agreeably. I'm very happy to engage with a differing perspective. I mean, I think that society makes progress through engaging with different perspectives and agreeing and moving forwards.
Yeah.
But so very happy to engage constructively with different perspectives. But I'm not willing to be called names.
Right.
I mean, backing Kemi's led to outright racism, and obviously I won't tolerate that.
Yeah.
And people can take their free speech somewhere else.
Yeah. It is weird because I remember being at school and we used to be able to debate quite freely. And I do worry for young people now that because of the education institutions that they're in and the time that we're in socially, people are so scared. Like a lot of young people are scared to say they're conservatives at uni, at school, and it's such a shame.
Well, it's an important point, really important. But I think something's going on, which the name of your podcast points to. You've called it ModCons for modern conservatives, right?
Yeah.
But modernism is a particular doctrine of worldview. So there's the ancient worldview, which tends to be, for want of a better term, tribal, very family-based.
Right.
Very taboos are still held in ancient worldview societies. The modern worldview, very rational, very linear, very scientific. And then the postmodern worldview is very different again. It's much more relational, much more comfortable with the juxtaposition of incompatible ideas, much more emotional, all that sort of thing. And my generation is on the cusp. I'm 53.
Right.
So for my generation, we're mostly moderns in our outlook. But if somebody's in their 20s or early 30s today, they'll almost certainly be a postmodern. And you see that manifest in things like trans. So for me, as a modern, difficult subject for people, but as a modern, people my age and older, it's man, woman, definitions, rational, this thing.
Right.
Whereas what I notice is that for people in their 20s, they're just much more comfortable with the fluidity of the meaning of these words.
Yeah.
And I just, because I'm a liberal, I just think we'll agree to disagree.
Right.
Where are the harms? So, for example, the problem of trans women in female prisons. There are so few trans people in this country, and such a tiny proportion of them are actually criminals.
Right.
We should just deal with that on a case-by-case basis. We don't need general rules to apply to everybody because we're talking about such tiny numbers of people.
Yeah.
Yes, they need to be treated justly, but we don't need our whole society of millions of people to tear itself apart over what actually is obvious, that you shouldn't put a rapist with a penis in a female wing.
Right.
Just deal with that differently. Have common sense. But what I would say, particularly to young people who might be watching this, is please be patient with older people because we've just got a different worldview.
True.
We're moderns in the traditional sense of it.
Yeah.
Is we're rational, linear, not very comfortable with fluidity. Things go in boxes, and that's what they mean. And this worldview transition, I think, is very poorly understood by politicians, particularly politicians of my generation, who just are wondering what on earth is going on with young people.
Yeah.
And I think we've got a duty to work out what is going on with young people, which is the transition to the postmodern mindset.
Right.
And instead of constantly trying to kick off against it and say this shall not pass, we need to find a way to uphold the principles of a free society in this new context.
True.
Gosh, you touched my hot button then.
I love that. That also brings me on to like the planet and climate. And that's also a big issue between young and old, just generally speaking.
Yeah.
And especially with a lot of our voters who went to like reform, they're very anti net zero. Whereas a lot of our young voters who maybe have voted Green or Labour are very pro climate change and taking it seriously. So how do is that a case of tolerance? Where's the kind of middle ground in that? What do you think?
Well, it's not so much a middle ground. It's about regaining this capacity to engage seriously with conflicting perspectives.
Right.
So anything that's a matter of public policy will involve trade-offs, balances of risk and cost and so forth. But, I accept that carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. I'm an aerospace and software engineer. I know that carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. It's very clear that our emissions as a society have contributed to climate change through carbon dioxide. But by asking questions like, are there actually enough electricians to put all this power infrastructure in place? Denier, they say. So, well, no, this is ridiculous. It's like an Aesop's fable, and it's not a good basis for our civilization to go on. There is a real problem of resources to deliver enough electricity to everybody, and one ought to be able to engage constructively with this.
True.
But I think one of the problems here is if you say to somebody, you are going to die. I watched it happen in the 2019 election. One of my opponents, I've just forgotten his name, but he was like an Extinction Rebellion candidate, except he presents as a very professional guy, you know, suit and tie, ex-army officer.
Yeah.
But I watched him say to audiences of school children, you are all going to die if we don't do this. And at the time, I wasn't especially well equipped. And so when I won in 2019, I stood at the camp and said, I'm going to familiarise myself with the climate arguments.
Right.
And they didn't like what I then did.
Yeah.
But it was very, very interesting. He stood again against me in this election.
Right.
And there was a silent consensus against everybody else that I was wrong about the climate. But it was the dog that didn't bark in the election. At the hustings, no one challenged my views on climate change.
Right.
And I thought that was very, very revealing. It wasn't an issue at this general election. Why did my candidates and my opposition candidates, why did they not raise it with me?
Yeah.
Could it be that they thought I was right? Probably not. But did they think if they raised it, I'd drive them into the ground like a tent peg?
Maybe.
Yeah. And this is the problem, is that it wasn't an issue in the election because they realised I have done my homework. I have worked out what the parameters of debate are, and they'd just rather be lazy and call me a denier than engage seriously with real problems. Now, my view is that such politicians deserve to be driven out of public life.
Right.
If they can't engage with the real world as it is, they just want to engage in school playground antics of labelling people.
Right.
Then they're not fit for public office, which I'm happy to tell them any day of the week.
Yeah. But do you think I know we've gone slightly off piece, but do you think in terms of like the climate debate that it wasn't brought up this election, well, apart from the fact that everyone was really angry at us, but because it's become quite a toxic issue. And if you do talk about green issues, then you're seen as like completely, doolally and living in a dreamland.
So the idea that the climate is changing, we should do something about it, is now, it is a consensus, and it's a consensus that I accept. The climate change is a thing and we should do some things. I don't mind if we end up on all electric. I do hate electric cars and motorbikes.
Yeah, you would,
but, if it's got to happen, it's got to happen.
Right.
But how we do it really matters. And I think one of the reasons it didn't break through is because I and others ran the cost of net zero campaign and it worked.
Right.
And we took a lot of big hits over it, but we forced the public square to engage with the feasibility of doing these things.
Yeah.
The cost of net zero is absolutely huge. And people will be screaming about the cost of doing nothing. I'm not suggesting we do nothing.
Yeah.
I'm suggesting we have a serious debate about the trade-offs and costs, the nature of the society that we're creating.
Right.
I mean, Patrick Vallance the chief scientist, wrote in The Guardian that a complete transformation of our society would be necessary. Oh, well, hang on, because end-to-end revolutionary transformations of society have been tried before, and they don't work very well. And that's why we're conservatives, is because we believe in change. Yeah, but incremental.
Slowly.
Yeah.
Yeah. No,
it's a big deal if we end up with the chief scientist being a revolutionary, a genuine revolutionary.
Right. Yeah, no, that's a really good point, actually.
And genuine revolutionaries, I mean, we joke about it, and Tom called for a conservative revolution. It's okay for a little bit of rhetoric.
Yeah.
But when someone seriously wants to overthrow our institutions and transform the basis of society quickly, then they should be, again, thrown out of public office.
Right.
It's dangerous and people get hurt.
Yeah, fair. When I asked you to do this podcast, your first response to my question, what is a liberal, was not a liberal Democrat. Music to my ears, but can you delve a bit further into that?
Yeah, so, I mean, to me, the Liberals, as were, when they were the Liberal Party, were one of the ancient parties of privilege, like the Tory party. Yeah. So you called me a Tory, Ellie. I'm really not a Tory. I'm not a Tory. I'm a repentant old Whig like Hayek. But when the Liberals and the Tories were the two big parties, they were parties of privilege. The franchise was not universal, and they were privileged, and there was a great deal of paternalism in both of them. So as the franchise expanded and working people could have their say, great, I'm all in favour of that. But they voted Labour, and there's a lot of class stuff involved there. And it completely crushed the Liberals. I mean, our party is the survivor party. When you look historically at vote share, we survive, we adjust. We tend to believe in power as long as we're wielding it, and we adjust to the memes of the day, and we believe in nation and all those sorts of things. So it tends to be quite popular because, of course, the facts of life are conservative, and all that. But the Liberals didn't really know how to respond to this. So they've always wanted proportional representation. That's their grievance.
Right.
But it's not really an answer for all sorts of reasons. But the crucial thing ideologically about the left, which includes the Labour Party and the Lib Dems, if they have completely swallowed Rawls' A Theory of Justice. Someone said that to me, and of course, being a contrarian, I went off and read Anarchy, State and Utopia by Nozick, which is the middle bit, the state bit, is the refutation of Rawls. And I think it's a really important thing. I mean, I've read a bit of Rawls, but it's one of those ones where you sort of read the refutation and you've understood the argument. But the point about Rawls is people say, well, imagine you were behind a veil of ignorance and you didn't know your place in society. What kind of society would you choose? Well, it's like, that's a funny place to start because the real world's not like that.
Right.
But they end up believing that justice is an equality of outcome. And that has particular problems, like it is a repudiation of the idea that justice is in the process. So if you and I agree voluntary exchange on an iPhone, and I suppose I was stupid enough to agree £10, I end up with £10 and you get an iPhone 15 Pro Max, which isn't a new one. It's not the latest one, but it's worth more than £10. Now, if I'm stupid enough to do that, is that an injustice that I agreed to do it? Right. Now, some people would probably argue yes, but the outcome is unjust. But with the justice of the process is I agreed to engage in it, which is, it's a simple example.
Yeah.
But this is the problem with the Liberal Democrats. By embracing Rawls' theory of justice as equality of outcome, it is a repudiation of justice in the process, and it overthrows the rule of law, because you can't treat people equally under the law and have equal outcomes. You've got to do one or the other.
Right.
You can either treat people the same under the law and their choices will have consequences and the outcomes will be different and reflect the choices they made. And yes, the environment they made them in. Or you can say we're going to have equal outcomes and we're going to treat people differently so that we get those equal outcomes. We're going to, yes, it doesn't matter how justly you earned that money. We're going to take it off you and give it to that person who did nothing. Yeah. Because we want equal outcomes, because that's fair.
Yeah.
And that's why the Liberal Democrats aren't liberals anymore, because they've embraced a flawed and false theory of justice. And it sounds like nice, everybody gets to be looked after. But the trouble is that unfortunately people do make different choices, and no, it's not unfortunate. It's unfortunate people make bad choices, which are harmful to themselves and others.
Right.
So I've done plenty of work with homeless people, many of whom will be people with drug addiction problems, and people with mental health issues. Their life's fallen apart. That's why they're homeless. So I don't wish to blame them, because that's the other place people go to. I'm not interested in blaming them. I just want to lift them up, stand them on their own 2 feet, get them in a home, get them a job, help them get off drugs, help them rebuild their relationships, help them.
Yeah.
But what I'm not willing to do is say that we're going to have equal outcomes for the person whose life fell apart because they allowed themselves to get onto drugs and so on. And yet people like to call it a disease. I prefer the term condition. It's certainly an affliction to be an addict.
Right.
But what we ought not to be doing is say this virtuous person who's never fallen, who's worked really hard, owes a very large chunk of what they've earned for themselves because this other person's ended up falling.
Yeah.
But to me, there's a both and injustice here. It does matter that we don't leave people behind to rot in the gutter.
Yeah.
But the conservative approach is to that humanitarian one, which says, I'm not willing to live in a society where we leave those people in the gutter.
Right.
And pick them up and do it ourselves.
Precisely,
because what I observe in our society, and you see it in London all the time, is despite the immense amount that we spend through tax and welfare, we've still got homeless people on the street, and we've had them on the street since forever.
Totally.
So what we do, and you see it with intergenerational poverty. The Centre for Social Justice pointed out that Labour were not working. Labour's policies were not working when we came to power in 2010, and the policies we've tried haven't been working. And we're going to have to do something different on poverty fighting.
Yeah, no, that's really, really interesting. And I think I totally agree with what you said about like fixing outcomes. It isn't right. And also people do learn by failing. So you've got to let people go on their own personal journey. Like people make mistakes in their, 20s, 30s, and then have completely turned their lives around. But if you fix things, you're not giving people that opportunity to actually grow. Yeah,
what is the dignity of human choice? And what is life about? Because this is a really important point. This is a foundational thing. What do we actually think life is about?
Yeah.
I think it's about growth. I think it's a process of becoming.
Yeah.
So we should be trying to become better versions of ourselves. We shouldn't be trying to become somebody else. And I don't like to compare myself to others. I prefer to compare myself to who I was yesterday, last week, a year ago. But life should be a journey of personal growth and improving ourselves. And too often people don't trouble with themselves with that difficult journey of self-reflection.
Yeah.
And instead say somebody else is doing it all wrong.
Yeah.
And it's not fair.
No, totally.
And well, that's not virtue.
Yeah, it's true. Well, this is kind of a random question, I guess now, but you recently said that if the Conservative Party doesn't stand for freedom, it stands for nothing.
Yeah.
So it's clear that you think that liberalism is conservatism,
Yeah.
but is conservatism just liberalism? And if not, what else is it?
Oh, my goodness.
Philosophy.
Yeah. So I think there are fundamentally three big political ideas. The idea the government should get out of our lives and let us be free within bounds, that we don't harm others, and I would call that liberalism. The idea that too much change is a bad thing, and we should respect traditions because they've grown up over years and they shouldn't be overthrown too quickly, and that would be conservatism.
Right.
And then there's the idea that we hate the institutions we have, we're going to kick the tables over and be progressive.
Yeah.
And I would these days, that's socialism. I mean, socialism used to be a synonym with communism,
Right,
and meant the state ownership of the means of production, the collective ownership of the means of production. That definition doesn't seem to be the one that people mean now when they say they're socialist. They seem somehow always to mean more state power in our lives, and think somehow that sets us free. So I don't think there's any logic to it.
Yeah.
But the funny thing about our party, the Conservative Party, is to me these days it embodies the entire spectrum of reasonable political debate, which is liberalism, libertarianism on the end of the up to the maximum of human freedom, as Reagan put it. And the conservatism, which says, "Oh, steady on, that's going a bit far. Whoa, we've got these institutions. I don't want to overthrow them. Bank of England's a good thing." And I would say, well, there shouldn't be a Bank of England. Right. And Walter Badenoch, who wrote the book on how to do central banking, he's the doyen of central banking. But if you read his book, he didn't think there should be central banks. Right. Well, I agree with Walter Badenoch. There should be no central banks. But Mark Carney put it to me, you think the central bank should be abolished. And I replied, as I just have to you. But this is the thing, the merely conservative would say, well, of course we should have the Bank of England because there it is. Well, I would say, well, hang on a minute, have you read the book? And of course, often conservatives haven't read the book. Right. But if you look at Hayek, for example, there's a collection of essays, Individualism and Economic Order, and he writes in there about individualism, true and false, and he talks about the importance of tradition. So people think he's a conservative. But if you pick up Hayek's The Constitution of Liberty, which Margaret Thatcher famously banged on the table with, "This is what we believe," the essay in the back, the appendix, "Why I am not a conservative." Interesting. Yeah. So when I went to my parliamentary assessment board, one of the essay questions was to write down why I am a conservative. Right. And I'd only just read this essay, so I just regurgitated it. That's hilarious. This is a confession. It's not. Yeah. So they told me afterwards. They said, "We shouldn't give you a debrief when you've been successful, but I just want to tell you that essay you wrote is the best one we've ever read." Wow. I thought, "Oh, really? Was it? I can't think how that happened." That's so funny. Yeah. I love that. But Hayek believed that he was an unrepentant old Whig, not a conservative. Right. And so this thing about our party, and I think one of the reasons why it adapts and changes, is that it contains the merely conservative. I think Jesse Norman wouldn't mind me calling him a conservative. And yet I read his book, Compassionate Economics, that he wrote before we were both elected in 2010. And it was brilliant. I said to him, "You're channeling Mises," who of course regarded himself as a classical liberal. Right. So, to me, these doctrines of liberalism and so forth, in the end, is probably best summed up by saying what an American conservative said to me: "A conservative is a libertarian with daughters."
Nice. I love that. That's really good. An interesting point you made about institutions. So like socialism potentially is about overthrowing institutions, and conservatives are about, maintaining them. Weirdly now, though, the conservatives don't really have much influence within institutions. Most of our institutions are run by socialists, which is quite strange how things have kind of turned. Well,
Blair did an amazing job. He had a huge cultural revolution. And we're now in a place where our institutions, it's the usual thing, the fish in the water. These are our institutions. But, some of my lawyer friends are better on this. Kemi obviously wants to go there, but, should we have had a Supreme Court, or should we have left it in the House of Lords? I mean, there's lots of aspects of our constitution which work extremely well in practice, but not at all in theory.
Right.
And maybe some of Blair's constitutional reforms need to be reversed, but I'm not the biggest expert in that.
Fine. No problem
It's
at all.
certainly the case that the intellectual consensus in our institutions is that those institutions should exist and that people within them should have power.
Right.
And
no, that's true.
And so when you're a politician, you turn up and you disagree with those people in those institutions. You have to do it ever so delicately.
Totally.
Because you can't turn up as Liz Trusted and say, you're the anti-growth coalition. It's like, it is. You can't do that. You've got to turn up and say, you're doing an amazing job.
Doing so well.
You're doing so well. I love it. It's just, unfortunately, because of these details, it's not quite working out the way that I want.
Right.
So what we're going to do is shut your institution down because it's not quite working out. Right. But you're doing an amazing job. And we're going to find you something else to do in the private sector.
Well, she should have been more conservative, slowly do it, as opposed to just ripping off the Band-Aid.
Yeah, you can't change the course of a supertanker by flying in like Superman at Mach 2.
Yeah.
That you'll just punch a hole in the side and sink it. And I'm afraid that's what she did.
Yeah.
And it's one thing to know you need a considerable change of direction. Great. It's another to get there in a way that is sustainable. So in particular, they did not understand the structure of the bond market.
Right.
In relation to particular leveraged investments. So when they did what they did, they caused a panic for those investors. But it doesn't mean that Liz's basic thesis was wrong. It means that her capacity to execute it fell on ignorance of the bond market.
Yeah, I think that there's that. Obviously, there's the Bank of England. So now let's talk about the Conservative Party.
Yeah.
So you famously talked reform, then the Brexit Party out of standing candidates in the 2019 election. As Boris noted recently in a round of media interviews, the influence of Farage and Tice at the time was quite minimal. They've since built a very powerful brand on the back of arguably liberal ideals. Do you think that if they had stood candidates in 2019 and be duly crushed, that the Conservative result of July 2024 would have been very different?
Jamila, you should go into journalism with the way you phrased that question. As Boris noted, Boris at the time thanked me profusely for getting them to not run candidates against. He thanked me profusely before Dougie Smith cut him out of the conversation because the Prime Minister ought not to be talking with me about that.
Right.
But Boris thanked me profusely.
Yes.
He didn't ring me up and say, oh, Steve, please don't do that because we'll beat them roundly because they have no influence. That's not what he said. He rang me up and said, oh, Steve, amazing. Thank you. Oh, brilliant, Steve. Boris did not ring me up to tell me to lay off because they were of no consequence.
Okay, fine.
That we were going to beat them roundly and drive them out of public life. Right. That isn't what happened. He thanked me profusely.
Okay.
And he was extremely grateful in a typical Boris style.
Right.
And then Dougie Smith came out of the conversation.
Right. So slight rewriting of history there. Perhaps.
I am not going to read his book because it will just annoy me.
Really
I've been too party to too many of these events to be interested or in what Boris thinks about rewriting things to be better in favour of his view of things.
Right.
He was very grateful at the time.
Okay.
And that was because they were very influential.
Right.
And they could have, them standing could have split the vote and delivered this kind of result, which we've had now. But with Jeremy Corbyn coming in as Prime Minister, with John McDonnell, and that would have wrecked the country for the rest of our lives.
Yeah, true.
And it was dead serious, and Boris knew it, and that's why he thanked me profusely. So I'm personally extremely amused, having actually had the phone in my hand with Boris Johnson on the other end of it, not for the only time.
Right.
Thanking me for what I did, for him to be now rewriting it and saying they were inconsequential, it's just typical.
Right, yeah, okay, fair enough.
And God bless him.
Well, he's got to sell Unleashed.
What? God bless him, but what a lot of nonsense.
Okay, perfect. Well, thanks so much, Steve. And so you recently said that we will and probably do need to leave the ECHR. Why do you think this? And does this mean that you're now Team Rob?
No, I'm going to support Kemi.
Nice.
So I think Kemi's approach, like Tom's, of being more measured in this is the right way, not least because the ECHR is there as a bulwark against totalitarianism. It's only in relatively recent history that in several places in Europe, several different kinds of totalitarianism arose with absolute state collectivism. Let's not forget that's what Nazism, fascism, and communism were. Absolute state collectivism.
Right.
And that's what the state collectivists don't like us to remember. But the ECHR is there to say to states, you shall not. And it's a good, the convention itself is a very good thing.
Yeah.
Now, the United Kingdom didn't need the convention. The convention's not there because human rights collapsed in the UK. but it's an important convention and statement of people's rights. It's much better than the United Nations Declaration, which has positive rights in it, entitlements at other people's expense, in order to try and get the Soviet Union on board. The Soviet Union then wouldn't join. But to me, legitimate rights are universal and reciprocal. So they're quite obvious to make them up. So you may not murder me, I may not murder you.
Good.
Yeah. And likewise, theft and so forth, and the right to a family life. I've got a right to my family, you've got a right to your family. But what then happens is progressive legal activists, some of whom are judges and some of whom are lawyers, take this right to a family life and then run a mile with it. And that's the problem.
Right.
If everybody could have just agreed there must be a line in the sand, these are the rights of the individual and the family.
Yeah.
And we will never fall below that line again. We will not tolerate falling below that line in Europe, because it can happen. It does happen. It has happened.
Yeah.
And so civilization is actually much more fragile than we realise. And leaving the ECHR is not itself a policy objective.
Right.
It's the means to an end. What we need to do is get a grip of illegal migration and legal migration. And also we need to be able to wage war in a way that means that legitimate use of lethal force can be applied, but discussed. I think it's much better to reform the convention and its rights.
Right.
And it ought to be possible to assemble a consensus across the members to do that, not least because Italy, for example, has a similar migration problem.
Fine.
So far, far better to attempt reform, and if we can't reform it, then to reluctantly leave.
Fine.
But to easily cast aside a bulwark against totalitarianism is very dangerous, not least because, as I've argued on my Substack, we're headed into still very difficult times.
Yeah.
I've written a book called Is This the Biggest Bubble in History, which people can get from my website. And I'm afraid, spoiler alert, yes, it is. The chief economist of the Bank of England, Andy Haldane at Penn, said we have deliberately blown the biggest bond market bubble in history. Well, it hasn't burst in the intervening years. If anything, the Bank of England has continued its policy first of cheap credit and then of masses of QE.
Right.
Well, that's only blown a bigger bond market bubble. Well, what do bubbles do? I'm afraid they burst.
Yeah.
Now, I believe that the whole world is in an enormous bubble because cheap credit and new debt has been used time and time again over generations to prop up the whole economy through monetary policy to avoid having recessions.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, it's sown greater and greater dislocations, causing real injustice, which is why people think capitalism doesn't work.
Yeah.
But of course, the monetary system we have is centrally planned.
Right.
And what is centrally planned economic activity? It is socialism.
Yeah.
Committees of wise people planning a price is socialism. The Bank of England is a socialist institution.
Right.
Now, they don't like that said, but again, consensus. They centrally plan a price. It's called the interest rate.
Right.
It's socialist.
Yeah.
And it's not working, and it's ruining us. Now, I personally believe that bubble will burst. Now, in the course of history in the past, when major bubbles like this have burst, you've had problems.
Yeah.
Like the Weimar hyperinflation.
Right.
Unfortunately, when everything's going wrong all around you, people vote for political radicals. And I don't wish to be hysterical, because I'm not, you can tell I'm not hysterical. I just think that history has proven that civilization is much more fragile than we generally believe. And so this is why I'm very glad to come on your podcast and talk about the proper version of liberalism and respect for human rights. Because unfortunately, with this, the psychological phenomenon of blaming the out-group means that when something goes wrong, we're not wrong, obviously, we're right. It's their fault.
Yeah.
And once a disaster has occurred and we blame someone else, then there's real danger, right? Because then the persecution starts. So I think it's extremely important to be ruthless in our examination of the facts, resolute in our grasp of ideas, and to really ask ourselves what has gone wrong. And was it the doctrines of classical liberalism and conservatism, or was it the doctrines of state power and collectivism?
Right.
And I'm very clear where the evidence is.
I know the answer to that one. We recently spoke to Tobias Elwood at conference,
Yeah.
and he noticed that a review of our Brexit deal with the EU is coming up. Is this safe in the hands of Labour? What do you think they might do? And what would you do if you were PM?
Well, I would say that no, it's not safe in the hands of Labour. And yet, yes, their hands are so constrained. So I'm doing an event with the EU ambassador next week at King's College.
Nice.
I invited him. I was invited on the panel with some professors. And so I said, can I invite the ambassador? And he's kindly said yes. So that's a bit of a fillip, and he's glad to come. He and I get on terrifically well.
Interesting.
And I'm afraid I don't want to spoil what I think is going to be said at that meeting. We are on this course now outside the EU, the course defined by the Trade and Cooperation Agreement with a free trade agreement. And again, there's a lot of wishful, ill-informed thinking about this, rather like the climate change debate. People think, oh, we can get closer. But hang on a minute, what do you mean by that? Because we can be closer. There's loads of problems we can solve while being an independent country.
Yeah.
Mutual recognition of qualifications. The problem of touring bans. It's called cabotage. But if you're a touring band, you should better drive across the channel and tour Europe.
Right.
And of course,
yeah,
it's crazy to prevent that, but dogmatically it has happened. Veterinary medicine's going over to Northern Ireland, things like that, easy to solve, not difficult problems to agree on, and still consistent with our status as an independent nation. But if you join the customs union, that on its own is not enough to get rid of queues. Turkey's in the customs union and has queues.
Right.
Norway is in the European Economic Area and has to follow all those rules, but it's not in the customs union.
Yeah.
And as a result, at the border, there are queues. The only way to completely get rid of queues at the border is to join the customs union and the European Economic Area.
Right.
And guess what? The only countries in both of those institutions are in the European Union.
Right.
So people have got to remember that the European Union is a legal construct. Now, the big breakthrough, it's still a hard compromise, but the big breakthrough in Northern Ireland was they came up with exceptional arrangements for Northern Ireland, reflective of their exceptional circumstances. And it's also a very small part of the European continent. And it's hard leaving in place some EU law in part of the UK. For unionism, that is an outrage. I'm accused of all sorts over it. But I do recognise that the EU bent its own rules to do it.
Right.
But what I hear now with people who want to be closer, it's all very emotional, and God bless them, and I want to give them a big hug. The people who are very Romanian, I do. I wish they would take a big hug from me, and I'd say, there, But we're not going to be allowed to go back into the EU now.
Right.
They don't want us back. We've been to a lot of trouble to get here, and they're not going to take us back. They've got their own problems.
Yeah.
Political radicalism, economic problems, German economic collapse in the face of their net zero plans. They got their own difficulties, and they don't want to be diverted once again to talking about the UK's relationship with the EU.
Right.
So Starmer will talk a reset. He'll do a bunch of stuff, which I'm sure I will have written down and written to a foreign secretary about while I was a minister that we needed to do.
Yeah.
I asked Rishi Sunak to make me foreign secretary so I could deal with it.
Yeah.
And I would have done a good job because I know what I want.
Yeah.
And crucially, I deal with our European partners with humility and resolve. The humility to recognise their legitimate interests, but resolution on our own. And if only we dealt with them with humility and resolve on their interests and ours from the start, how much easier it would have been.
Yeah.
If instead of putting citizens' rights on the table, we'd said to European citizens, you're welcome. We're glad that you're here. This isn't about you.
Yeah.
Or in the sense that it is about you, it's because you're welcome. We love the fact that you're here.
Right.
We just can't deal with these numbers. Leaving the European Union, insofar as it's about immigration, it's about numbers.
Yeah.
We need to have some control because we're an island nation.
Totally, yeah.
But you are welcome and we want you here. And I don't know how we're going to do it yet in law. This is a Prime Minister speaking.
Right.
But we are going to secure your right to be here because
Yeah.
we want you here because you're vital to our country and you're welcome.
Yeah.
And we're going to make the same demand of the European Union that British citizens should continue to be welcome right across the European Union.
Yeah.
And if we'd started like that,
Yeah.
how different it would have been. But unfortunately, citizens' rights were put on the table. I was a minister at the time, and I think, what do you do? I said that this is not right, but I could have been appointed, resigned straight away.
I think you're right. It's all about setting the tone, and it was just a bit chaotic at the start.
Again, that's why I was able to support Tom, because Tom
Yeah.
wanted to be in the EU, but having left, he agrees with me that the only way to do it is with free trade agreements,
Right.
including with the EU.
Yeah.
And a broad and deep free trade agreement through the Trade and Cooperation Agreement is fine,
Yeah.
because it doesn't subordinate our law to theirs. And I'm afraid there's a lot of people who haven't faced up to the reality of the institutions which are the EU. You can either
Yeah.
be in them or not.
Yeah.
And we're not. So
Yeah. And so, with the news that Kemi and Rob are the final two, what are your hopes for the future of the Conservative Party?
I hope that the Conservative Party will make attractive to a majority of the nation the doctrines of freedom.
Yeah.
Because there is no other way to deal with the problems that we face. We cannot afford the system of society that we have set up, and it is not working very well. But since it is the system of society which Labour fundamentally stands for, interventionism, state interventionism, Labour won't solve it. They can't. They will
Yeah.
they will deepen and worsen the crisis with stupid ideas like the idea of the entrepreneurial state. The state is not an entrepreneur. It doesn't care about profit and loss.
Right.
So Labour will make everything worse. We will have to be ready to come back and not being angry or irascible, but just be very, very neutral and moderate and make attractive the idea of recapturing the principles of a free society. And yes, looking after those who can't look after themselves with a working safety net that lifts people up. We should have a big heart for doing that. But we should be saying we're lifting you up into freedom so that you can go on and contribute to the lives of others in the free market. Contribute to the lives of others in the free market. It's not merely selfish. And we should be lifting people up into the free market, and we should be having a just and sustainable society, which we can be proud of.
Oh, Steve, thank you so much for joining
You're
us
welcome.
today. Really appreciate it.